On March 7, 1945, at 16:35 hours, Private First Class Thomas Bennett, a combat medic from the 9th Armored Division, moved through the smoking remains of a German defensive position on the east bank of the Rhine River in Remagen, Germany. Despite German demolition attempts, the Ludendorff Bridge miraculously stood intact, now providing a crucial crossing for American forces into the heart of Germany. The defenders who had failed to destroy it lay scattered among the fortifications. Bennett heard a high-pitched whimper, unlike the usual sounds of wounded combatants. He followed the noise to a crater where a German soldier, barely a teenager, sat clutching his left leg. Blood oozed from his fingers, and despite holding a pistol in his right hand, the trembling suggested he lacked the strength or will to use it. When Bennett approached, the boy raised the pistol, his face pale with terror. Bennett could now see his features clearly. A smooth, youthful face barely touched by adolescence, eyes wide with fear, and lips murmuring what might have been a prayer. The uniform hung loosely on a frame that appeared underfed even before combat. This wasn't a soldier. It was a child dressed in a soldier's costume. "Easy, son," Bennett said softly, raising his empty hands. "Medic, sanitator." The boy's gun hand wavered, and his face contorted with confusion and fear. As Bennett took another step, the boy tossed the pistol aside and pressed himself against the crater wall, sobbing, not the controlled tears of a man, but the desperate crying of a child who had reached the limits of endurance. Bennett knelt beside him, gently moving the boy's hands away from the leg wound, which had been caused by shrapnel. The bleeding wasn't arterial, so survival was possible. Bennett pulled out his medical kit and began working, while the German teenager watched in bewilderment, as if witnessing magic rather than simple first aid. "You're going to be okay," Bennett said, hoping that his tone would convey reassurance, even though the boy likely didn't understand English. "You're safe now." The boy, still trembling, took a long drink from Bennett's canteen and then, with wide eyes, whispered a single word in German, one that needed no translation. Krieg, meaning war. Bennett didn't have a response that would fit the word or the context. He simply shrugged and patted the boy's shoulder gently before moving on to tend to the next wounded soldier. The boy sat in the crater, staring at the clean bandages on his leg, like they were evidence of something that had seemed impossible. By March 1945, the collapse of Nazi Germany had reached its logical conclusion. The regime had fed children into the military machine, using the Volkssturm and Hitler Youth as desperate measures to resist. These adolescents, barely more than children, had been conscripted into desperate defensive actions, facing professional armies while the regime that had betrayed them crumbled around them. The statistics told a grim story of institutionalized child sacrifice. Between January and May 1945, approximately 80,000 to 100,000 Hitler Youth members aged 15 to 17 were sent to fight, with 20,000 to 25,000 killed and 30,000 to 40,000 wounded. Some 35,000 to 45,000 teenage German soldiers were captured by American forces, with an average age of 16.3 years. The majority of these young soldiers believed that Americans executed prisoners, as Nazi propaganda had convinced them that Americans were barbaric monsters, particularly towards young soldiers. Many of them, conditioned to expect torture and death, chose suicide over capture. The propaganda created a terrifying paradox. Teenage soldiers fought to the death not out of courage, but out of fear of capture. For the German POWs who survived and encountered American medics, the experience was disorienting. The reality that American soldiers were trying to save their lives contradicted everything they had been taught about their enemies. Many POWs initially refused treatment, preferring to die untreated rather than face what they believed would be torture. 16-year-old Klaus Richter, severely burned near Cologne, recalled his disbelief. "I'd been taught that Americans skinned prisoners alive. When the American medic started treating my burns gently, giving me morphine for the pain, I thought I was already dead, and this was some kind of afterlife. Hallucination, the realization that American medical care was genuine and not the prelude to execution, led to emotional breakdowns for many young German POWs. The psychological transformation was rapid, often occurring within hours of receiving care. The terror of capture drained away, replaced by confusion, gratitude, and tentative trust. The shared experience of receiving medical care in the same field hospitals, often in adjacent beds, meant that wounded American soldiers and teenage German POWs found common ground. Both groups received the same treatment, regardless of nationality. The proximity forced an acknowledgement of shared humanity that had been obscured by the brutality of combat. The distinction between enemies and patients became less important as the universal desire to survive and heal took precedence. The same doctors, nurses, medics, and orderlies cared for both groups with the same commitment, providing no distinctions in the quality of care based on nationality. The same level of nursing attention given to American patients was also extended to German teenage POWs, demonstrating values that Nazi propaganda had claimed Americans didn't possess. Staff Sergeant Edward Morrison, a surgical technician at a field hospital near Frankfurt, described the ward dynamics. We had American kids and German kids in the same ward, all wounded, all scared, all wanting to go home. The German teenagers would watch how we treated our own wounded, and then realize they were getting the same care. You could see it in their faces, the propaganda crumbling, being replaced by understanding that we actually gave a damn whether they lived or died. The field hospitals became sites of cultural exchange despite language barriers. American patients would share candy and cigarettes with German teenagers in neighboring beds. Nurses would learn German phrases to communicate with young POWs. In turn, the German teenagers would practice their English, ask about America, and share photographs of families they missed. This breaking of indoctrination was more powerful than any formal re-education program. The medical care provided by American forces became the most effective form of denazification for the captured teenage German soldiers. No amount of formal education could match the persuasive power of experiencing mercy from people they had been taught were merciless. The psychological impact of this treatment was felt at multiple levels. The immediate experience of medical treatment contradicted specific propaganda claims about American brutality. The sustained quality of care demonstrated a systematic commitment to humanitarian values rather than individual acts of mercy. The professional competence of American medical personnel revealed organizational sophistication that undermined Nazi claims about the inefficiency and chaos of democratic societies. 17-year-old Hermann Schultz, wounded during the Ruhr pocket fighting, described his transformation. I'd spent 3 years in Hitler Youth being taught that Americans were subhuman criminals who would torture and execute German prisoners. Within 48 hours of capture, American medics had saved my life. American nurses had provided care my own military hospitals couldn't match, and American soldiers had shared their food with me. Every single thing I'd been taught was revealed as lies. The medical care didn't just heal my wounds, it destroyed my faith in Nazi ideology. This denazification through medical care proved more effective than formal programs because it was experiential, not educational. Teenage POWs didn't read about American values or hear lectures about democracy. They lived it, experiencing firsthand that Americans treated wounded enemies with dignity. They saw that democratic societies could be both strong and compassionate, and that military power didn't have to be tied to cruelty. The burden for American combat medics treating teenage German POWs was particularly heavy, as it carried psychological costs that exceeded the trauma of treating wounded American soldiers. They faced the moral complexity of saving the lives of young enemies, children, whom they or their comrades had just wounded in combat, all while struggling with anger at a regime that had sent them to die. Medics often experienced conflicting emotions simultaneously: professional satisfaction at saving lives, rage at Nazi leaders who had sacrificed these children, grief for the teenage years they had lost to warfare, and guilt about the American actions that had wounded them. Private First Class Robert Henderson, who kept a diary documenting his experiences, described one such encounter. "I treated a 15-year-old today. He had shrapnel wounds to his chest and arm. He was terrified when I approached, kept trying to crawl away despite the wounds. When I finally got close enough to treat him, he was crying and begging in German. I think he was begging me to kill him quickly rather than torture him. When he realized I was actually bandaging his wounds, he looked at me like I was performing a miracle. I saved his life. I don't know how I feel about that. He tried to kill Americans yesterday, but he's just a kid who never had a choice. This war is all wrong." The emotional burden was particularly heavy for medics, who were also young men in their early 20s, treating boys just a few years younger than themselves. The small age gap made identification easier and more painful. These medics could imagine themselves in the teenage POW situations and could recognize how thin the line was between their own lives and the lives of the enemies they were treating. Some medics coped by adopting paternal attitudes toward teenage POWs, treating them like surrogate sons or little brothers rather than enemies. Others maintained strict professional distance, focusing on the medical tasks at hand instead of emotional connections. Most medics struggled to find a balance between the compassion that made their work meaningful and the detachment that made it sustainable. American military medical doctrine, reinforced by the Geneva Convention, made no distinctions based on age, nationality, or military status when treating wounded combatants. Combat medics were explicitly trained to save lives, regardless of the uniform those lives wore. However, this doctrine confronted the complex emotional reality of treating enemy combatants who were clearly children. Medics who had treated wounded veterans throughout the European campaign now found themselves providing care to boys who appeared young enough to be their sons or little brothers. The cognitive dissonance between enemy combatant and wounded child created moral and psychological challenges that medical training had not addressed. Corporal James Walsh, a medic with the 1st Infantry Division, described his emotional conflict in a letter to his wife. "We treat German wounded the same as our own. That's Geneva Convention and Army doctrine. But when the wounded German is 15 years old and crying for his mother while you're working on him, the professional distance becomes impossible. You can't see an enemy soldier. You just see a terrified kid who should be in school, not bleeding out in a foxhole." The medical treatment provided to teenage German POWs often exceeded the minimum Geneva Convention requirements. Medics gave extra morphine to ease psychological trauma alongside physical pain. They spent additional time offering reassurance in broken German, shared cigarettes and candy, provided comfort items from their personal supplies, and generally treated young POWs with paternal care that went beyond clinical necessity. The lasting bonds formed between American medics and teenage German POWs during medical treatment often extended beyond the immediate crisis of battlefield medicine. Medics would check on young POWs during recovery, bring extra rations, help write letters to families, and advocate for their transfer to better facilities. The bonds transcended the formal structure of captor and captive, medic and patient, victor and defeated. They became relationships between individuals who had shared intense experiences, one who had saved a life and one whose life had been saved. Technical Sergeant Michael Romano, a chief medic who treated dozens of teenage German POWs, maintained correspondence with several of them after the war ended. In a 1946 letter to his wife, he explained, "These kids didn't choose the war or the ideology. They were victims as much as our own wounded soldiers. When you save someone's life, you become responsible for that life in some way. I can't just walk away from the boys I patched up and pretend they don't matter." They matter because they're human beings who deserved better than what their government gave them. The post-war correspondence between American medics and former teenage POWs documented ongoing relationships that defied simple categories. The letters discussed recovery and rebuilding hopes for the future, expressing gratitude that transcended national boundaries and wartime enmities. They proved that mercy during war could lay the foundations for peace. After the war, the transformation through care continued, with American medical treatment creating lasting changes on both an individual and collective level. Teenage German POWs discovered that enemies could show mercy, and as a generation, they experienced American values through direct action, not propaganda. This transformation influenced post-war German attitudes toward America and democracy. Young men who had been treated by American medics became advocates for Western alignment during Cold War political debates. They shared their stories with family, friends, and eventually their own children, telling them about the Americans who had saved their lives when Nazi propaganda had promised only death. This medical care also shaped American self-understanding of what their military service had meant. Medics who treated teenage German POWs found deeper meaning in their service, knowing they had saved lives instead of letting their enemies die. They had shown that American values included mercy, even toward young enemies who never chose their allegiance. The closing memory came on March 7, 1995, 50 years after the crossing of the Remagen Bridge. An 80-year-old Thomas Bennett attended an anniversary ceremony in Germany. After the formal events, a man approached him, walking with a slight limp but otherwise healthy and prosperous, wearing a business suit. The man studied Bennett's face carefully before speaking in accented English. "Sanitator Bennett, you treated my leg wound the day Americans took the bridge. I was 16 years old and expected to be executed. You saved my life and showed me that everything I'd been taught about Americans was propaganda." Bennett's memories flooded back across 5 decades. He recognized something in the man's face, the echo of the terrified boy who had thrown away his pistol and cried while Bennett had wrapped his calf.
"Klaus?"
he asked tentatively. Klaus Richter confirmed, "I live in Bonn now. I'm a doctor, a surgeon. I chose medicine because of what you did that day. You showed me that healing is stronger than harming, that mercy matters even during war. I've spent my career trying to live up to the example you set when you treated an enemy child with the same care you'd give a friend." Bennett, typically reserved, found himself embracing the man who had once been a wounded boy. "I was just doing my job," he said quietly. "Geneva Convention said treat all wounded. That's what I did." "No," Richter insisted. "The convention said the minimum you had to do. You did more. You gave comfort along with care. You treated me like I mattered, like my life had value, even though I'd been your enemy hours earlier. That extra measure of humanity, that's what changed me. That's what I've tried to pass forward through my own medical career." The story of American medics treating teenage German POWs never became celebrated history. It was overshadowed by combat narratives, strategic decisions, and dramatic battlefield victories. Medical care for wounded enemies doesn't produce stirring imagery or clear heroes for popular consumption. But for the thousands of teenage German soldiers who survived wounds that would have killed them without American medical intervention, the medics who treated them represented the truest victory America achieved, not the defeat of armies, but the demonstration that democratic values included mercy toward enemies, especially young enemies betrayed by their own leaders. The teenagers who expected execution but received medical care instead carried that experience throughout their lives. They became the generation that rebuilt Germany as a democracy and aligned with the West during Cold War tensions. They taught their children that American soldiers had been liberators rather than conquerors. And it all began with medics who knelt beside wounded teenage enemies and provided care when they could have walked away, who wrapped bandages when they could have withheld treatment, who offered water and morphine and comfort to boys who had tried to kill Americans hours earlier. They proved that mercy could survive even in the total brutality of war, that professional medical ethics could transcend national hatreds, and that treating enemy children with humanity would create foundations for peace. That military victory alone could never build the bandages they wrapped around the legs and arms of teenage German soldiers became bridges across the deepest divides that war had created. Those bridges proved stronger than any bomb or bullet in building the peaceful Europe that emerged from the war's ruins. Chuang Ti Ding Duan, Chuang Ti Di Duan.